The Los Angeles night was a vibrant tapestry of light and sound. The palm trees lining Sunset Boulevard swayed gently in the warm breeze, their fronds rustling like whispered secrets. Headlights from passing cars painted fleeting streaks of white across the sleek facades of the surrounding buildings. The air thrummed with the energy of the city, a mixture of ambition, dreams, and the ever-present pursuit of fame and fortune. Amidst this bustling scene, the Grand Oak stood as an oasis of refined elegance. A discreet brass plaque near the entrance hinted at its history, a history now intertwined with Hollywood legend. The recently renovated interior of the restaurant glowed invitingly, casting a warm amber light onto the street. Inside, the grand dining room was a symphony of tasteful opulence. Crystal chandeliers, polished mahogany, and plush velvet seating created an atmosphere of understated luxury. The gentle murmur of conversations, the clinking of silverware, and the soft strains of a jazz trio created a sophisticated ambiance. Tonight was a typical Friday evening at the Grand Oak, a gathering of Los Angeles's elite. Young tech moguls, their designer suits impeccably tailored, mingled with social media influencers, their phones poised to capture every moment of their dining experience. Older, established families, their lineage steeped in generations of wealth and influence, maintained their weekly traditions, their hushed conversations weaving tales of old money and power. In a quiet corner of the dining room, at his usual table, sat Clint Eastwood. Dressed in a simple gray polo shirt and casual slacks, he could have easily been mistaken for any other older gentleman enjoying a quiet evening out. He nursed a glass of amber-colored whiskey, his gaze calmly surveying the room. Most of the veteran staff recognized him, of course. They had received strict instructions from him 6 months ago when he had quietly purchased the Grand Oak. Treat him like any other customer. Clint believed that the true measure of a restaurant wasn't in how it treated celebrities and the ultra-wealthy, but in how it treated ordinary people. During his periodic visits, he preferred to observe, to assess the quality of service, to ensure that the spirit of the Grand Oak remained true to its roots. He wanted to make sure the soul of the restaurant remained and had not been replaced by pretentiousness. Rachel, however, the Grand Oak's newest waitress, was unaware of Clint's ownership and his philosophy. Fresh from a prestigious hospitality school and determined to build her own social media empire as a food influencer, she had spent the evening flitting between tables, fawning over social media personalities, and casting disdainful glances at the underdressed man in her section. Her perfectly manicured nails clicked on her order pad, and her practiced smile was as cold as a mountain stream. Thomas, the longtime manager of the Grand Oak, watched Rachel's behavior with growing unease. He recognized the look in her eyes, the same look she had given a retired surgeon the previous week for wearing loafers instead of formal shoes. But tonight, he sensed, was different. Tonight, Rachel's arrogance would lead to consequences she couldn't possibly imagine. Thomas had been at the Grand Oak for over 20 years. He had seen everything and everyone come through those doors. He had pride in this building, in its history, and in what it stood for. He also knew Clint Eastwood and what he stood for. As Rachel's high heels clicked across the polished floor toward Clint's table, Thomas held his breath. The veteran staff tensed, recognizing the ominous calm before a storm. Miguel, a young busboy who had immigrated from Mexico 2 years earlier, paused in his work, his eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. He recognized the man in the polo shirt. He had grown up watching Clint Eastwood's movies with his father, each film a shared moment of escape and inspiration. Clint took another sip of his whiskey, his gaze steady and unwavering. The quiet man in the simple polo shirt was about to become the center of a very public lesson in humility. Rachel approached the table, her iPhone strategically positioned in her apron pocket, ready to capture a moment of social media gold. Her smile, carefully practiced, did not quite reach her eyes. "Sir," she began, her voice a condescending drawl, "I couldn't help but notice you've been nursing that house whiskey for quite a while now." Clint looked up, his gaze meeting hers with the same steady calm that had confronted countless Hollywood executives over the decades. "It's a good whiskey," he replied simply. Rachel continued, her tone dripping with fake concern. Perhaps, she said, her eyes scanning his attire with thinly veiled disdain, you'd be more comfortable at the bar. We're expecting several reserved parties, and this table, she gestured to the pristine white tablecloth, is typically for our dining guests. Miguel, still nearby, his hands tightening around the bus tub, fought the urge to speak up. He knew exactly who this man was, and he knew that Rachel was making a terrible mistake. He wanted to defend the man who had brought so much joy into his life and his father's life through his films. "I'm comfortable here," Clint replied, his voice calm and even, taking another unhurried sip of his whiskey. Rachel's professional veneer cracked slightly. She glanced at her watch, then at a group of young tech executives waiting by the host stand. "Sir, our executive chef prepares a very exclusive menu," she said, her voice laced with a subtle challenge. "The prices," she paused meaningfully, her eyes lingering on his casual attire, "reflect the caliber of our establishment." At the next table, an older couple who had been regulars at the Grand Oak for 20 years shifted uncomfortably. The husband started to speak up, but his wife touched his arm, recognizing the look in Clint's eyes, the same look that had preceded some of cinema's most memorable moments. They had come to the Grand Oak since they were newlyweds. They had seen it all, and they knew that this situation was about to escalate. "I'm aware of the prices," Clint said quietly, his voice carrying that familiar gravelly tone that had commanded attention in countless films and television shows. "And the chef's work." Rachel's smile vanished completely. She pulled out her order pad with sharp, irritated movements. "Well then, sir, shall I explain our menu?" "Slowly." The last words carried a distinct jab at his age. Miguel, still within earshot, could no longer contain himself. He stepped forward, his voice quiet but determined. "Miss Rachel, maybe I should get Thomas." "Stay out of this, Miguel," Rachel snapped, her eyes flashing with anger. "Go bus tables, that's what you're here for." She turned back to Clint, who had watched the exchange with particular interest in Miguel's attempt to help. "Now, sir, one last time." The tension in the dining room was becoming palpable. Other guests were trying not to stare, but the contrast between Rachel's growing agitation and Clint's unshakable calm was drawing everyone's attention. The clinking of glasses and the murmur of conversation had ceased, replaced by a hushed anticipation. "One last time," Rachel continued, her voice rising enough to draw attention from nearby tables. "This isn't some diner off the highway. This is the Grand Oak. Perhaps in your day things were different, but now we have standards." Clint set his whiskey down slowly, deliberately. The movement was subtle, but it commanded more attention than Rachel's outburst. A few of the older patrons recognized it, the same measured calm before some of cinema's most iconic moments. "In my day," he repeated softly, one eyebrow rising slightly. "Yes, my day, when people could just walk in anywhere, dress however they wanted, order the cheapest drink, and take up space meant for real customers." Rachel was fully committed now, months of bottled-up disdain for unfashionable customers pouring out. "Times have changed. This is a luxurious environment for people who appreciate modern luxury." Miguel had stopped pretending to clear tables and stood frozen, watching the disaster unfold. Behind him, Thomas, the manager, was quickly walking over, having finally noticed the situation spiraling out of control. "Modern luxury," Clint repeated thoughtfully, as if testing the words. His half-smile returned, a hint of amusement playing at the corners of his mouth. "And what exactly does that mean to you, Rachel?" The use of her name caught her off guard. She wasn't wearing a name tag, but she recovered quickly, assuming he'd heard another server use it. "It means," she declared, emphasizing each word, "understanding that some places aren't for everyone. Our clientele expects a certain ambiance." She gestured toward a group of young entrepreneurs taking selfies with their gold leaf desserts. "They get it. They respect what the Grand Oak represents. They're not here pretending to be something they're not." The irony of her statement hung heavy in the air. A few veteran servers exchanged knowing looks. Thomas was now just steps away, his face pale. Clint mused, that familiar half-smile still playing on his lips. Interesting choice of words. "Listen," Rachel snapped, her patience finally exhausted. I've tried to be polite, but you clearly don't belong here. This isn't some set for one of those old cowboy movies. This is a prestigious establishment, and I won't have you ruining the experience for our real guests." The moment the words left her mouth, Thomas froze mid-step. Miguel dropped his bus tub with a crash that echoed through the suddenly silent restaurant. The older couple at the next table audibly gasped, but Clint's expression didn't change. He just reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and made a single call. "Jerry, could you bring me the ownership papers? Yes, right now, and the renovation plans we discussed last week?" He set the phone down and looked back at Rachel, who was starting to sense that something was very, very wrong. "You see, Rachel," he continued in that same quiet voice, "I've been coming here every Friday for the past 6 months, sitting at the same table, ordering the same whiskey. Want to know why?" Rachel's face had begun to pale, the implications slowly dawning on her. Each realization was worse than the last. She had not only insulted a customer, she had insulted a legend. She had not only insulted Clint Eastwood, she had insulted her own boss, and not just any boss, a living legend who had built his career on characters who stood up against exactly the kind of arrogance she had just displayed. "Miss," Clint said, his voice carrying that familiar gravelly tone that had commanded respect across 6 decades of cinema. "Let me tell you a story about this place." He gestured around the dining room. 50 years ago, I came here for the first time. Wasn't famous yet, wasn't anybody. Wore a shirt pretty much like this one. The owner back then, Old Man Thompson, treated me like I was the most important guest he'd ever had. Not because of who I was, but because that's how he treated everybody." He paused, taking another sip of his whiskey. "When his son wanted to sell the place 6 months ago, I bought it for one reason: to preserve that spirit. Real class isn't about designer labels or social media followers. It's about dignity, respect, and treating everyone like they matter." Miguel, still standing nearby, straightened up a little taller. The older couple at the next table nodded approvingly. Even some of the young influencers had put down their phones, caught up in the moment. "So," Clint continued, fixing Rachel with that legendary steady gaze, "the question isn't whether I belong here. The question is whether you understand what this place really stands for." Rachel's eyes filled with tears, her carefully constructed worldview crashing down around her. But what happened next surprised everyone, especially her. "I could fire you right now," Clint said, his voice gentler now. "But that's not what this place is about. Instead, I'm going to give you a choice." He gestured to Miguel, who stepped forward nervously. "This young man tried to warn you. He recognized me, not from social media, but because he watched my films with his father. He understood something you didn't. Respect isn't about appearances." Turning to Miguel, Clint spoke with quiet authority. "Son, how would you like to start training as a waiter? We could use more people who understand what real service means." Miguel's eyes widened with disbelief and gratitude. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." "As for you, Rachel," Clint continued, "your choice is simple. You can walk out that door and find another job at a place more focused on modern luxury, or you can learn from Miguel and our veteran staff about what real hospitality means. Your call." Rachel wiped her eyes, looked around at the dignified faces of the longtime staff, and made her decision. I'd like to stay and learn, sir, if you'll let me." "Good choice," Clint nodded, finishing his whiskey. Thomas put Miguel in charge of her retraining. As the tension in the room dissolved, the older couple at the next table began to applaud. Others joined in, not for the celebrity in their midst, but for the lesson they had just witnessed. A reminder that true class has nothing to do with clothes or status, and everything to do with how we treat each other. Today, the Grand Oak remains one of LA's finest restaurants, not because of its luxury, but because of its heart. And if you stop by on a Friday evening, you might just see a man in a casual polo shirt sitting at his usual corner table, quietly ensuring that the old values of respect and dignity live on.